They rolled into battle thinking they were untouchable. Japanese tank crews had crushed every enemy they'd faced for 7 years straight. Their Type 95 tanks had dominated Chinese forces, battled Soviet armor, and swept through Malaya and the Philippines like an unstoppable wave. These weren't rookie crews. These were veterans who'd seen real combat, who'd survived when others hadn't. They trusted their machines completely. But on a dark morning in June 1944, everything they believed was about to shatter in the most brutal way possible. What happened on Saipan that night didn't just destroy tanks. It destroyed the illusion that courage and experience could overcome cold, hard mathematics. This is the story of the moment Japanese tankers discovered their armor couldn't stop bullets from a standard American machine gun. And once you understand what went wrong, you'll never look at World War II the same way again. The Type 95 wasn't some rushed design thrown together in desperation. Japanese engineers spent years perfecting it, starting back in 1933 when military planners realized their existing tanks were painfully slow. The Type 89 could barely hit 15 miles per hour, which meant it couldn't keep up with motorized infantry moving by truck at 40 miles per hour. They needed something faster, something that could exploit breakthroughs and chase down retreating enemies. Engineer Tomio Hara took on the challenge and created something genuinely innovative for its time. The bell crank suspension system he designed became legendary in Japanese tank development, offering a smooth ride over terrain that would have stopped other vehicles cold. By June 1934, the first prototype was tearing across proving grounds at 45 kilometers per hour, leaving observers genuinely impressed. The tank weighed just 7.4 tons fully loaded, mounted a respectable 37mm gun, and used a Mitsubishi diesel engine that produced 120 horsepower. That diesel engine was actually brilliant. It meant less risk of catastrophic fires and better fuel availability across Japan's empire. The specifications looked solid on paper. 12 millimeters of armor, designed to stop rifle fire and machine gun bullets, enough speed to keep pace with rapid advances, and mechanical reliability that kept it running when supply lines stretched thin. Japanese military brass approved it in 1935, and production started rolling in 1936. Everything seemed perfect for the war they were planning to fight. When the Type 95 first saw serious combat in China, starting in 1937, it performed exactly as designed. Chinese forces had virtually no armor, and their anti-tank capabilities were almost non-existent. Japanese tank crews rolled through defensive positions like they weren't even there. The 37mm gun demolished fortifications, the machine guns cut down infantry in the open, and the speed allowed crews to exploit every advantage. Victory after victory built a dangerous sense of invincibility among Japanese tankers. They learned their trade in an environment where they were clearly the apex predators. Then came Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks with 45mm guns showed the Type 95 had serious vulnerabilities. Soviet armor was thicker, their guns hit harder, and Japanese crews discovered their rounds often bounced off while Soviet shells punched through. Japan lost dozens of tanks in that campaign, and the lessons were crystal clear to anyone paying attention. But those lessons got buried under continued success in China. When the Pacific War exploded in December 1941, Japanese tanks swept through Malaya, navigating terrain the British thought impossible for armor. In the Philippines on December 22nd, Type 95s fought American M3 Stuart light tanks near Damartis in close-range jungle combat. Both tanks mounted 37mm guns, and the Japanese scored some wins, destroying at least one M3 in the initial clash. These victories kept feeding the confidence. From the Japanese perspective, their tanks worked. Crews trusted their machines completely. Commanders relied on their armor. And when orders came to defend Saipan, nobody questioned whether the Type 95 was up to the task. If you'd opened the hatch of a Type 95 and looked inside, you'd immediately understand why American tankers couldn't believe anyone could fight effectively in these conditions. The entire vehicle measured just 14 feet 4 inches long, 6 feet 9 inches wide, and barely 7 feet tall. An average height man could literally look over the turret. Inside that tiny shell, 3 men were crammed into spaces that would make a closet feel spacious. The driver sat in the front left with minimal vision through a crude periscope and a small viewport. Next to him, the home machine gunner operated a 7.7mm gun from what was basically a cubbyhole with almost no room to move. But the commander had it worst. He stood in the turret with no seat, no rest position, nothing. His job was insane by any standard. He had to command the entire tank, directing the driver and trying to coordinate with other tanks using visual signals since only one tank in 4 had a radio. He operated the main 37mm gun, aiming and firing while standing. He loaded that same gun, a physically exhausting task in such cramped quarters, and he manned a rear-facing machine gun mounted at the 5 o'clock position. All of this while standing, with his head and shoulders exposed if he needed decent vision. The armor protecting this nightmare workspace was laughably thin, 12mm at its absolute thickest on the turret and upper hull, 9mm on the roof, 6mm on the floor. Japanese designers calculated this would stop rifle bullets and machine gun fire at combat ranges, and they were right about that. What they didn't account for was what would happen when their tanks faced weapons specifically designed to penetrate light armor.
Operating from Saipan could reach the Japanese homeland. The island had to be held at any cost. So when Marines hit the beaches on June 15, 1944, they were facing nearly 30,000 defenders, almost double what intelligence had estimated. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner ordered the assault at 05:42 hours, and by 08:40, the first wave was storming ashore under brutal fire. By nightfall, 20,000 Marines were on Saipan, but the beachhead wasn't secure. Japanese artillery still hammered the landing zones, and counterattacks came wave after wave through the darkness. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the defense, knew he had a narrow window. If the Americans consolidated their position and brought their full firepower ashore, the battle was over. He had to strike hard and fast before they were ready. His plan centered on the 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Takashi Goto. 44 tanks, a mix of Type 95 Hagos and the slightly larger Type 97 Chihas with 57mm guns, represented the largest Japanese armored force yet committed in the Pacific. This wasn't a desperate last stand. This was a calculated offensive using Japan's best available assets. Colonel Goto gathered his crews on the night of June 16th. They ran final maintenance checks, loaded ammunition, topped off fuel tanks, and tested the few radios they had. These weren't inexperienced kids. Many had fought in China or earlier Pacific campaigns. They'd seen combat, survived it, and learned from it. They trusted their equipment because it had kept them alive before. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 17th, diesel engines coughed to life, and 44 tanks began rolling toward American positions. At 03:30 hours, Marine sentries heard them coming. The distinctive sound of diesel engines and clanting tracks echoed across the darkness. Officers screamed orders, men grabbed weapons and sprinted to defensive positions, and anti-tank gun crews traversed their weapons toward the approaching noise. Sherman tank crews scrambled into their vehicles and fired up their engines. The Japanese attack came in force, 44 tanks representing everything Japan could commit, with infantry clinging to the hulls. Then something completely unexpected happened, something that would fundamentally change how both sides viewed Japanese armor for the rest of the war. Marine machine gunners opened up with their Browning M2 50 caliber heavy machine guns. These weren't standard infantry weapons. These were heavy weapons designed to engage aircraft and light vehicles, firing 12.7mm rounds at over 2,900 feet per second. The armor-piercing variant could punch through 23mm of hardened steel at 200 meters. At 500 meters, it could still penetrate 19mm. The Type 95's armor was 12mm thick at its maximum. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. At the ranges where this battle was being fought, under 200 meters as tanks closed with Marine positions, the 50 caliber had more than enough power. Tracer rounds arced across the battlefield in brilliant orange-red lines as Marine gunners opened fire. What happened next shocked everyone. The rounds didn't just dent the armor or ricochet off at angles. They ripped through the armor as if it weren't even there. They penetrated cleanly and decisively. At close range, some rounds went completely through one side of the tank and out the other. Inside those cramped Type 95s, Japanese crews experienced something worse than defeat. They experienced revelation. The heavy machine gun fire wasn't just impacts on the hull exterior.
It was penetration, rounds coming through the armor into their tiny fighting compartment where there was nowhere to hide. Marine machine gunners watched their tracer rounds strike tanks and saw sparks inside through vision ports and hatches. Tanks that kept advancing suddenly slowed, stopped, began smoking from their engine compartments. Crews tried to bail out and were immediately cut down by rifle fire. One gunner on a half-track engaged a Type 95 at 150 meters, firing sustained bursts into the side armor. He watched the commander in the turret slump forward and fall. The bullet had gone through the thin turret armor, through the man, and out the other side. Another Marine aimed at an engine compartment, targeting the rear deck where cooling vents created vulnerabilities. His 50 caliber rounds punched through the 6mm armor covering the engine. The diesel cylinders, opened by the impacts, seized immediately. The tank stopped cold and the crew abandoned it, running back through a hail of fire. Japanese tank crews couldn't process what was happening. They'd trained for years, fought successfully in China where enemy weapons bounced off their armor, survived battles against Soviet anti-tank rifles. Their tanks were supposed to protect them. That was the fundamental promise of armored warfare. But American machine guns were defeating their armor. Not specialized anti-tank guns, not artillery, not even the massive 75mm cannons on the Sherman tanks now moving into position. Standard infantry support weapons mounted on jeeps and half-tracks were tearing their tanks apart. Then the Shermans opened fire, and the contrast became devastating. Where the Type 95 weighed 7.4 tons, the M4A2 Sherman weighed 31.8 tons. Where the Type 95 had 12mm armor, the Sherman had 51mm on the frontal hull, angled at 56 degrees to provide protection equivalent to about 75mm against anti-tank fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun could destroy a Type 95 from over a mile away. When those guns fired, Japanese tanks were blown apart, turrets knocked off hulls, ammunition detonating inside crew compartments. Japanese crews who returned fire watched their rounds bounce harmlessly off Sherman frontal armor. By mid-morning on June 17th, the counterattack was finished. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks littered the battlefield, with some sources claiming up to 35 when including those knocked out by artillery beyond the immediate combat area. Perhaps 1,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, including most of the tank crews and the infantry who'd advanced with them. The 2nd Marine Division had stopped a major armored assault, but it had been close. Division commanders later acknowledged that if the attack had succeeded, it would have been catastrophic. For Marines walking among the destroyed tanks afterward, examining them up close, a different truth emerged. These weren't the formidable war machines they'd expected. A Marine officer called his men over to look at a destroyed Type 95, pointing to the holes in the armor. Clean, round penetrations where 50 caliber bullets had punched through. The exit holes on the far side were slightly larger and rough-edged, where bullets had torn through after crossing the interior. You could put your fist through some of them. Inside the destroyed tank, the scene was worse. The cramped interior showed signs of multiple penetrations. The commander's position had no protective features, no armor thick enough to stop heavy machine gun fire. The manual hand crank for turret traverse was crude. Gun controls were rudimentary. There was almost no space to move. Everything was cramped and utterly vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. Marines who'd fought at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier remembered seeing Type 95s there. At the time, with Marines equipped primarily with light weapons and no armor support, the Japanese tanks had seemed threatening. But now, with proper equipment and heavy weapons, the Type 95 looked exactly like what it was, a light tank from the 1930s. Adequate for colonial warfare, but utterly inadequate for modern industrial combat. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese tank crews was crushing. Those captured Japanese tankers whose disabled tanks left them with no choice but surrender had to face uncomfortable truths. Intelligence officers noted a consistent pattern in their responses. They expressed shock at American firepower, talked about the casual abundance of ammunition and supplies they'd witnessed, and many felt betrayed that their own leaders had sent them into battle with inadequate equipment while claiming technological parity. One veteran commander who'd fought in China since 1937 told interrogators something profound. He'd believed Japan would win through superior fighting spirit and devotion to the emperor. After Saipan, after watching machine gun fire penetrate his tank's armor, after seeing American Shermans shrug off Japanese anti-tank fire, he knew that spirit couldn't overcome material disadvantages. Training and courage meant nothing when your equipment was fundamentally inadequate. The numbers behind this disparity were staggering. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, a purpose-built facility operated by Chrysler, employed 5,000 workers, producing tanks around the clock in 3 shifts. In December 1942 alone, that single facility produced 97 Sherman tanks. That was more tanks in 1 month than Japan produced in an entire year. And Detroit wasn't alone. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Michigan produced over 11,000 Shermans. American Locomotive Company converted from making trains to build 2,300 tanks. Baldwin Locomotive Works produced 1,200 tanks while maintaining locomotive production. 10 major manufacturers, plus countless subcontractors producing components, tracks, engines, radios, and weapons, represented industrial mobilization on a scale never seen before. By the time production ended in June 1945, American factories had built 49,234 Sherman tanks. Japan produced approximately 2,300 Type 95s over the entire course of the war, from 1936 to 1943. The ratio was more than 20-to-1. But even that understates the disparity because American tanks were vastly more capable individually. Japanese industrial capacity simply couldn't compete. The pattern established at Saipan repeated on every subsequent island. On Tinian in July 1944, 7 Type 95s were destroyed in counterattacks against Marine positions, torn apart by the same combination of 50 caliber machine guns, bazookas, and Sherman fire. On Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese commanders learned from Saipan's disaster and dug their tanks into caves, using them as stationary pillboxes because they recognized the tanks had no chance in mobile warfare. Even buried in defensive positions, they remained vulnerable. 50 caliber rounds could still penetrate turret armor, and flamethrower tanks could direct napalm into open hatches and vision ports, cooking crews alive inside their steel coffins. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, Colonel Takichi Nishi's 26th Tank Regiment buried their tanks in volcanic ash up to the turrets, using them as armored bunkers because the tanks provided more protection when stationary than when moving. It was a desperate adaptation, born from bitter experience. On Okinawa, the last major battle of the Pacific War, the Japanese committed the 27th Tank Regiment with 13 Type 95 Hagos and 14 Type 97 Chihas, 27 tanks total. The Americans landed with over 800 tanks. The numerical disparity was 30-to-1, and the qualitative gap was even greater. On May 4th and 5th, 1945, Japanese forces launched a major counteroffensive to drive the Americans off the island. Tank units were committed to support the infantry assault. The attack failed catastrophically. Most Japanese tanks were destroyed within hours, knocked out by Shermans, bazookas, anti-tank guns, artillery, and 50 caliber machine guns. The survivors withdrew, having accomplished nothing except adding more destroyed hulls to the battlefield. When the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria in August 1945, Japanese tank units in northern China faced T-34 medium tanks with sloped armor and powerful 76mm guns that vastly outclassed anything Japan fielded. The experience of Japanese tank crews during the war's final years was one of gradual, crushing realization that everything they believed about their equipment was fundamentally wrong. The crushing weight of reality. After the war ended, surviving Type 95 tanks were shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for detailed examination. American engineers and armor specialists spent months studying them carefully, measuring armor thickness at multiple points, testing the steel quality through metallurgical analysis, evaluating the internal layout with detailed measurements and photographs.
Their reports confirmed what had been learned in combat and what mathematics had predicted.
The Type 95 was adequate for operations against poorly equipped opponents, but completely unsuitable for modern industrial warfare against a peer adversary. The 50-caliber armor-piercing rounds didn't just penetrate, they overpowered the armor completely, punching through with energy to spare. The internal arrangement was cramped to the point of being actively dangerous. The commander's workload was unrealistic. The lack of radios in 3 out of 4 tanks made coordination nearly impossible. Every aspect of the design reflected the constraints Japan faced: limited industrial capacity, resource scarcity, and a design philosophy rooted in experiences against inferior opponents. For Japanese tankers on Saipan that morning in June 1944, and every Japanese tanker who fought afterward, the lesson was brutal and clear. They were obsolete. Their equipment was obsolete. Their tactics were obsolete, and there was nothing they could do except continue fighting with what they had, knowing survival was unlikely and victory impossible. The Marines learned different but equally important lessons. They learned that industrial might matters in modern warfare, that having better equipment in larger quantities makes an enormous difference, that courage and training cannot overcome fundamental material disadvantages. When those first 50-caliber rounds punched through Type 95 armor on Saipan, they proved something that echoed through the rest of the Pacific War. In industrial warfare between modern nations, production capacity matters, design philosophy matters, and resource allocation matters. No amount of courage can overcome a 20-to-1 numerical disadvantage, combined with generational gaps in equipment quality. The Type 95 represented Japan's impossible situation. Ordered to fight a superpower with equipment designed for a different war, Japanese crews climbed into their tanks believing they had reliable, capable machines. By sunset on June 17th, survivors knew the truth. They'd been sent to fight with armor so thin that machine gun bullets went straight through.